Welcome to the Wisconsin Women in Conservation Summer Camp. We're so glad you joined us today. Today we will be talking about managing your land legacy. I'm Noemi Serrano and I'm your summer camp counselor today. I work for Michael Fields Agricultural Institute and I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator for this project. We have other WiWiC team members on the call today. Most of them, or a few of them, will be wearing these beautiful WiWiC yellow shirts today, but team members, if you can wave, that would be greatly appreciated. Just a quick reminder, feel free to munch on lunch today. We have two great speakers who will be sharing information during our time today. To make sure everyone can hear them, we will keep everyone muted until the end, at which point you will have a chance to unmute yourself and ask a question if you have something you'd like to ask. But during the next hour, we want to encourage each of you to use the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Use the chat function to ask any questions that you might have, to make any comments, share any resources that you might want to share with us. And we'll be answering questions in the chat. WiWiC team members will be answering questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll also leave some towards the end for a little Q&A. So we've already practiced this chat function a bit as people came in and we were waiting. But if you didn't introduce yourself, feel free to introduce yourself. But if also you didn't share where you're joining us from, feel free to share that in the chat right now. And then, like I said, at the very end, we will have some time for us to chat out loud, unmute yourselves, ask any questions you might have, and we'll stay on past the official end time for anyone that wants to stay for a bit longer, just in case we miss any questions and whatnot. Perfect. So we are here today to support each other as we work to care for and steward the land. Part of that process is understanding the history of how we ended up on this land, who was displaced from this land, and what our place is within that history. I want us to remember that our land acknowledgement embraces both an awareness of past injustices and a recognition of ongoing efforts. The space where I live occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk tribe. I would like us to take a moment to reflect on what land acknowledgements means to you. And as you continue to reflect moving forward, I encourage you to educate yourself on the current efforts of the First Nation people. If you are interested in some resources, please let us know and we can share those with you. I'm going to pause for just a second because there we go. Kristin is sharing that. Beautiful. Thank you so much. So just a quick introduction of WiWiC. There is a poster, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Kristin. So WiWiC is a 3-year project that is a partnership of 5 different organizations. We are each working in a different region of the state with the goals of building connections between women farmers and landowners through workshops and field days, providing conservation education, and helping to create plans for conservation across the land. We are in year 2 of the project and just received word that we've been granted 2 more years of funding, which is really, really exciting. Here on the screen, you can see the map of Wisconsin with our different regions in different colors. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm the regional coordinator for the Southeast. So I work with Racine, Walworth, and Milwaukee County, and each coordinator works with 3 different regions, but of course, you're always welcome to join us from outside of those counties as well. So I think up next we have, perfect, share the timeline. We have some summer field days coming up. We've kicked off our summer field days. The Southeast one just happened earlier this month, but on the screen here, you can see the ones that are yet to come. There's one on this Sunday, the 28th at Red Door Family Farm, and then we have one in September, early September, and then on the 10th of September. So whatever's closest to you, we highly recommend you check them out. These field days are always so much fun and you learn so much. If somebody can share a link, or maybe they have already shared a link in the chat, on our WiWiC website, you can find upcoming events and sign up for them there. So thank you for sharing that. We also have our fall workshops, which is really exciting. We're already planning for the fall. We have Harvest Your Conservation Potential. These will be happening in September and October all throughout the state. And again, you can register for those on our website, wiwic.org/upcoming events. Thank you. We also have Queen Bee sessions, which are awesome podcast sessions. You can find those on our website on the blog section. The latest one is session 3 with Marcy Hess, who I believe is on this call. Really great interview. So definitely recommend checking it out. Thank you. And we have conservation plans, which we will be talking about briefly towards the end of this call, but conservation plans is something that we do for WiWiC. It's one of the main things that we try to connect you all with. It is a document that outlines the decisions that you have made to protect and enhance the natural resources of your land. And it's something that our conservation coaches can help us with, or we can connect you with NRCS staff or other conservationists to help you do that. So it's a great resource for WiWiC and highly recommend checking it out. Okay, thank you so much. Today, like I said, we have 2 fabulous speakers. We have Terra with Farmland Trust. I will let her introduce herself, and then she will share some beautiful information about land easements, and then we will switch it over to Kristin Jersic, who will give us an example of who has a land easement, and then we'll follow it up with Kara, who will finish out. So Kara, if you would like to introduce and share your slides. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Noemi. As Noemi said, my name is Terra O'Connor. I work for American Farmland Trust, a nationwide organization that seeks to protect farmland, enhance conservation practices on farmland, and prepare the next generation of farmers. Prior to working at American Farmland Trust, I had the pleasure of working at Wisconsin Farmers Union for over a decade. Before that, I was an intern at the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, and many moons ago, I served on the board of Renewing the Countryside. So it is a real delight to have the chance to collaborate with all of these organizations, again, in the context of your work with Wisconsin Women in Conservation. Thank you so much. I'd like to say personally that I use my skills as a lawyer, a lobbyist, and a fundraiser, some of the very least beloved professions, on behalf of some of the nation's most beloved people, America's farmers, ranchers, and conservationists. And one of the topics that I absolutely love to talk about is what is a conservation easement and why might it be a useful tool for you as a farmer, rancher, or conservationist? So let's start with the why first. Why might a conservation easement be useful to you? A conservation easement gives you assurances about how your land will be used, and more specifically, how it will not be used in the future. If your property is protected with a conservation easement, you have the certainty that it will never become a parking lot or a trailer park or a subdivision of McMansions. It will never be paved over to make an interstate highway. A conservation easement can also be written in such a way to ensure that your farm will never become a CAFO, or that the stream bank areas on your property will always be protected with setbacks and grass waterways, or that some minimum soil and water conservation practices will always be in place on the cropland. So how do you do this? How can you control what happens on your land even when you don't own it anymore? An analogy that is really helpful for thinking about how you manage what happens with your land is to think of your land ownership rights as a bundle of sticks. So I have my bundle of sticks here as a demonstration. This is how every first-year law student learns to think about property rights. So I get to give you a little legal education today without the law school debt. Your ownership of your land actually entails a bunch of different rights. And those rights are represented by each individual stick here in the bundle. You have the right to farm your land, to hunt it, or otherwise derive income from the use of the land. You have the right to lease your land to someone else. You have mineral rights under the ground that you can sell or lease while still retaining your ownership of the surface of the land. And you have the right to develop your land, to convert it to commercial or residential development subject to the limitations of your local zoning laws if you live in a place that has zoning laws. So each of those individual rights are part of the bundle. And usually we think of property rights as owning a piece of property as a singular thing, but it's very useful to think about those rights as being separate sticks in the bundle. So in the case specifically that we're talking about today, development rights, you can separate your development rights, the right to develop your land into residential or commercial property, from the rest of your ownership. And while this right to develop the land goes away, you still own the rest of the bundle of sticks. Once you separate out that development right, any future owner to whom you sell the land cannot develop the land because they didn't buy that right when they purchased the land. So they can't exercise a right that they don't own. It's not part of the bundle anymore. Where did the development rights go? That's the next obvious question. And so to talk about that, I'm going to pull up my slides. Give me just a moment. All right. What you see here are the three essential components to any easement transaction: a willing landowner, an easement holding entity, and a funding source. So the answer to where did that development rights stick go, it went to the easement holding entity. The way that I like to think, and an easement holding entity can be a nonprofit land trust. You may be familiar with a land trust in your area. Or it can be a unit of government that has a farmland or other conservation land protection program that's set up to hold easements. I like to think of that easement holder as the keeper of a promise. That is that the land will never be developed and that any soil and water conservation provisions in the easement are upheld. Easement holders, one of the things that they do, an easement holding entity, is to visit all properties on which they hold easements every year to keep an eye on the property, to make sure that the easement terms are being upheld. And if there is a violation of the easement, if something that was part of that promise isn't being respected, an easement holder takes action to bring the easement back into compliance. They start with voluntary action, so trying to get a future landowner to voluntarily comply with the terms of the easement, but if necessary, they pursue legal action in order to make sure that the terms of the easement are upheld. That's a really sacred, important promise. American Farmland Trust is an easement holding entity. We hold easements on over 100 properties nationwide, and we take that responsibility of holding an easement and protecting those development rights very seriously. A conservation easement is permanent, so it's recorded with the deed, with the county register of deeds, and the restrictions that are put in place run with the land. So anyone who owns that land in the future will be bound by the terms of the easement. It's simply the most powerful conservation tool that we have because it's permanent. Along with that permanence comes a big responsibility, like we've talked about, and that is what leads us to the third component, the funding source. In order to, a promise to protect land in perpetuity is only as good as the ability to enforce that promise or to uphold that promise. And in order to be able to do that well, an easement holding entity needs funding. And so that is money that's set aside to monitor and defend easements. And in addition, in an easement transaction, there may also be a need to compensate the landowner for the development rights that they're giving up. So going back to that bundle of sticks, this is the land that you own. You know what it's worth based on an appraisal or an assessment or something like that. If you take out the development rights, that's part of what you used to own in the bundle. you may want to be compensated for giving up those development rights. In that case, if that's part of an easement, conservation easement transaction, then a funding source would need to be identified in order to compensate the landowner for what they're giving up, which is the right to develop the property. Let's talk about some initial questions that we would think about when we're thinking about an easement transaction. First, is it a farm? Now, lots of what I will say today in my presentation will apply equally to farmland and natural land, like forest or wetlands or prairies. And that may be the description of the land that you own. So lots of the things that I'll say are universal to any kind of conservation easement, whether it's on farmland or natural land. But I make this distinction right up front, number one, because I work for American Farmland Trust. Our specialty is protecting farmland with easements. And because when we think about those two of the essential components to an easement transaction, the easement holding entity and the funding source, those may differ according to what kind of land you have. American Farmland Trust, as the name suggests, is an easement holding entity that's primarily focused on farmland. And so we hold easements on farmland, but generally not on land that is exclusively natural land, like a prairie or a forest. But conversely, there are some land trusts that focus specifically on natural lands protection. And so whereas they probably wouldn't hold an easement on a land that's primarily farmland, they would be interested in holding the easement on natural lands. So your choice of easement holding entity may differ based on what kind of land you own. And second, the funding source may differ based on what kind of land we're talking about in an easement transaction. So there are funding sources that relate specifically to farmland. For example, the funding sources through the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, generally focus primarily on farmland, whereas there are other funding sources through the federal government, state government, or private sources that focus on natural lands. So that's why this distinction matters up front, that it may affect what easement holding entity you would work with and what funding source you would use. Let me also make a couple of comments about what is farmland. So farmland includes the things that we think about right away, cropped land, but it definitely also includes land that's used to raise livestock, pastures, if you have a rotational grazing operation, fields where, that are there for the use of livestock. It also includes land that is in the Conservation Reserve Program. If you have land that is in CRP, in order to be in CRP, that land had to have had a cropping history in the past or a farm history in the past. And so for the purposes of an agricultural easement and for the purposes of the USDA, that's considered agricultural land. So you would be able to answer yes to the question of is it farmland if you have land in CRP. All right, so if the answer was yes, let's assume to the farmland question, the next very important threshold question is everyone on board with the idea of an easement? This is a really important question because an easement is a voluntary tool. It can only come into being if all of the landowners agree to bring it into being. In the category of everyone, I would also include anyone that you have in mind or that you have the expectation of being the owner of the land in the future or the steward of the land in the future. It will be a challenge to go forward with a conservation easement if everyone is not on board with the idea of permanently giving up the development rights in order to make sure that the land is conserved in a particular way. If everyone is not on board with the idea or not comfortable with an idea of a conservation easement, I've listed a few options that you can next steps that you can pursue. One is to share this webinar with those who may be uncertain or who are interested in learning more. You could consider buying out their share of the property if that's an available option to you. Partitioning the property so that each person owns a certain number of acres with which you can do as you choose. Or last but not least, putting your conservation energies elsewhere. One of the things that I absolutely want to convey in this presentation is that an easement isn't the right tool in every situation. And one of the things that I hope will be useful about this presentation is helping you identify when it is and is not relevant to your situation or a good option for your situation. So the question is everyone on board is an important threshold conversation to have with all of your fellow landowners. Let's assume though that everyone is on board. The next question that we can ask is, which of the following three options best describes your situation? I'll give you just a minute to take a look at those. And we'll talk about each of those in turn. So in the first instance, some of you may be in the position that you could donate all or most of the value of your land in exchange for that forever promise of your land always remaining a farm and certain conservation practices being upheld on the farm. Going back to that bundle of sticks analogy, a donation of land for conservation purposes looks like donating the full bundle of sticks to a conservation organization, an easement holding entity. And that organization would then have the obligation of protecting the land with a conservation easement, because that was what they had agreed to in writing. And most likely, at least in the case of American Farmland Trust, when we receive a donation of land for conservation purposes, we protect the land with a conservation easement consistent with the donor's desires. And then we sell that land to a new landowner with the conservation easement in place. That means that future landowner and any other future landowners are bound by the terms of the easement. What are the advantages of this kind of easement transaction? First of all, it's the fastest way to achieve your conservation objectives. Second, it is likely provides you the largest tax benefit, especially if you inherited the farm. So inheriting the farm can sometimes entail or result in some significant capital gains tax exposure. And making a donation of a farm for conservation purposes can provide a pretty significant benefit when it comes to avoiding capital gains taxes. Third, it hands down entails the least paperwork for you. When you donate the farm in exchange for the promise that an organization will protect it with a conservation easement, that means that that other organization is going to do all the paperwork and all the legwork involved in creating and recording that conservation easement. That's not an insignificant task. And in a farm donation scenario, you get to get the assurance of the easement without having to do any of the work of the mechanics of putting the easement in place. That can be a real advantage for some people. And finally, the donation can be now or in the future. So if you know that you'd like to donate your farm for conservation purposes, but don't want to donate it quite yet, that's a donation that you can make in your estate plans. I also want to mention a really cool tool, and that is a donation of land with a reserved life estate. So if you know that you'd like to donate your land, but you still like to be able to own the land, maybe farm it yourself, or maybe lease it and receive the rental income, you can do what's called a donation with a reserved life estate or reserved life use. What that means is you make the promise of the donation now, and you receive the tax benefit of that donation now, but you retain the right to work the land, to lease the land, to otherwise control the land throughout your lifetime, or as long as you're interested in managing farmland. And that's a really nice option for people who are still interested in having their feet on the land, but want to receive a current tax benefit and know that this is what they want for the eventual future of their land. So again, going back to that bundle of sticks analogy, you would be donating the full bundle except for this one stick, and that is your life's use, right, to use the land during your lifetime. So you make the donation, reserve the life's use for your lifetime, and knowing that the organization that you're donating it to is going to then hold the development rights and in the future eventually sell the land to a new landowner. If this is a scenario that makes sense to you, your next step would be to contact American Farmland Trust or someone that you know at your local land trust and say, I'd like to learn more about donating my farm for conservation purposes. Not all easement holding entities are in a position to receive donations of land. American Farmland Trust is a relatively large easement holding organization with a nationwide scope, and so we are in a position to receive donations of land for conservation purposes. That's not necessarily true of all easement holding entities. And one of the things that is also true about AFT is that we have an in-house legal team with some tax experience and experience with some complex transactions, including those with unique tax implications, reserve life estates, special soil and water conservation provisions. So we're in a position to receive donations of land. Many other organizations are as well. And this can be a really nice option for the reasons described here, if that situation describes you and your family. The next option is a donation of an agricultural conservation easement. This is going back again to our bundle of sticks. What this would look like is donating the development rights to an easement holding entity while keeping the rest of the bundle of sticks. So you still retain the right to sell the land in the future and to lease it, to farm it. All that you have given away or donated is the right to develop the land. This can be also completed relatively quickly, almost as quickly as a farm donation. And it can also provide significant tax benefits. Congress wants to encourage people to donate their development rights for conservation purposes, and as such has created some nice tax benefits for people who do so. One of the things that I do want to flag is that in this kind of transaction, that perpetual stewardship of the easement takes resources. And so an easement donation will probably also entail making a donation to the easement holding entity, probably on the order of around $10,000 in order to monitor that easement in perpetuity. This donation could come in many different forms, that including a present donation of cash or stock. It could be a pledge of a donation when you sell the land in the future, or it could be a gift to an easement holding entity like a land trust in your will. So easement holding entities, I think, generally try to be very creative about how you can make that contribution to their stewardship fund. But I want everyone to be eyes wide open about the fact that there is a cost to stewarding even a donated easement. And so that usually entails a donation to the easement holding entity. The third option is the sale of a conservation easement. And we are really lucky today to have Kristin Jersic on to talk about exactly this, how the sale of their development rights, the sale of an easement on their land worked in their family, and what it has meant to them. So I'll just go over the basics and then turn it over to Kristin to talk about how that played out in their case. Sorry about that. Selling an easement is the option that makes the most sense for many individuals, especially those who have farmed their whole life and whose retirement savings are primarily in the form of the land that they own. This is the slowest avenue for pursuing an easement because finding and applying for funding to pay for the purchase of the easement can take years. The funding sources that are available for purchasing an easement include local, state, or federal farmland protection programs. Now, the good news is that we have some new funding in Wisconsin for easements through the Wisconsin RCPP project. That's a USDA project. And in addition, the recent Inflation Reduction Act included quite a bit of new federal funding for farmland protection easements. So if an agricultural conservation easement could fit into your 3 or 5 or 10-year plan for your farm, my message to you is to get into the queue now with your local easement holding entity, either a land trust or a unit of government that holds easements, in order to express your intention to investigate this option and to make sure that you're in line if those funds become available. So now I'm going to pause and turn things over to Kristin to talk about how this process worked for her and her family. Kristin Jersic is a Wisconsin Women in Conservation coach for the Southeast region of Wisconsin, and she and her family manage Bratzett Family Farm in Jefferson, Wisconsin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm Kristin Jersic. I and my family manage Bratzett Family Farm. So this kind of ugly looking aerial photograph that I made really quick before this call is an outline of our farm. So our farm is about 300 acres all total. Of that 300 acres, 250 of those acres have a conservation easement on the farm. So the little jot out on the east, that is not included in our conservation plan. And so I do not own this property. Our farm LLC leases the majority of this property. I actually only own like 40 acres of it. So it is very much a family farm, and we've always very much been conservationists. So what we do in this farm is we practice rotational grazing. And I feel like that's our short-term conservation. And then our long-term conservation is the conservation easement. So I was just jotting some notes as Kara was going through her slides so I could follow her explanation. So our conservation easement, we sold our conservation easement. So it was a purchased conservation easement. It was paid for by the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, DATCAP, and by the NRCS. They each paid for 50% of our conservation easement. And that's actually how I met Kara, because while we were in the process of putting our conservation easement on, the Walker administration decided maybe they'd like to cancel 16 contracts for conservation easements. And at the time, Kara was working for Wisconsin Farmers Union and joined the 16 farmers together and helped save that funding for 16 farms. However, the program has never been refunded. So our conservation easement is held by the Drumlin Area Land Trust. It's a land trust that holds conservation easements in Jefferson and Dodge County. Each land trust needs a backup land trust in case something happens to that land trust. So the backup holder of our conservation easement is Jefferson County. So our Jefferson County Land and Water has a conservation fund as well. And they also hold conservation easements. So they hold ours. Kara talked about conservation practices that you might have to keep on the landscape. And the only mandated conservation practice that we have to do on our farm is we have to keep a current nutrient management plan. So we have to follow all nutrient rules, which is very easy for us to do. So I saw several questions pop up in the chat about different land use practices. So you can kind of see by this aerial photo, I would think that we have quite a bit of forested land on our property. So yes, the forested land was included. We also have quite a bit of CRP that doesn't show up on this, but we also have quite a bit of CRP property land on our property. Yes, that was included. We have an agro, I guess we have a silver pasture planting that can be included. And like I said, all of our whole farm is in grass and is fenced for rotational grazing. So grazing is very much included. One of the things we did on our property is that when we put the conservation easement on it, is that we limited the amount of roofs and concrete so that our farm could never be developed as a CAFO. We have the right to farm our land. We have the right to sell our land. We just do not have the right to mine our land. So on this property, on the original 250 acres, we cannot open a sand or gravel pit or quarry. We cannot put a racetrack on the property, and we cannot subdivide it for houses. So on this initial 250 acres, we could have sold it for, I think we could have put, just the way the property was joined back together, I think we could have put 9 residential splits we could have taken per our county zoning. And so basically when we think about selling a conservation easement versus donating it, we kind of had this conversation, Carrie and I did, and I just really, if you're a farmer and you're a conservation farmer and that's what you've done all your life, you likely don't have much money put away for retirement. It's just the fact of farming. Farming is a great way of life, but yields very little income when you're a conservation farmer. So I see conservation easements as a great way to help in farm transfers, whether it's within your own family or whether it's to a beginning farmer. Several ways to look at it. One, the beginning farmer could buy the property and put the conservation easement on it, be paid for that, and then significantly pay down their mortgage. Or the existing landowner could sell the conservation easement and then sell it at a reduced price to the next landowner, if that's what they so wish to do. Or somebody could put the conservation easement on it, know that their property was already secured, and then just go ahead and sell the property. So those are my thoughts on sales versus donating. Another thing is most existing farmers don't really need a big tax write-off. So that limited income that we do make as farmers doesn't yield the need for a large tax write-off for the donation. So a couple of circles that are on our landscape has changed over the past 20 years considerably in our neighborhood. So the magenta circles with the lines through them, this is like our block, the block that our farm is in the center of. And so those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those 5 farms right on our block were all dairy farms 20 years ago. And there were actually 6 dairy farms that surrounded our farm. And the ones that are circled in magenta with the line through them are no longer dairy farms. So those are all just row crop farmers now. They all got out of dairy because they were all mid-sized dairy farms. The green circle just north of our property is the only dairy farm that remains on our block. And that's a trend we've all seen all over Wisconsin. Then the red circles are new homes that were built within the last 20 years just on our block. And there's many, many more that are just a few miles away, but I just wanted to illustrate our actual block. And so, those dairy farms are gone and those houses are there. And we really just think it was important. We didn't want to do that on our property. We didn't want to develop more homes. My parents are the ones that purchased the property and paid for the property and worked really hard to do so. And they wanted it to be protected into perpetuity. So that's why they put a conservation easement on it. They learned a lot from American Farmland Trust. They went on some tours out east to Pennsylvania and to Ohio and saw other farms and learned a lot about conservation easements on those trips. And they came back and decided we worked really hard to pay for this property. Interesting fact, they purchased about 175 acres in 1968. We've all added on to it since then, and they paid $30,000 for their land, which was less than my last car cost, right? So, but they worked hard to pay for that. And so some people had asked my mom, don't you feel like doing this is sort of like ruling from the grave? And her response was, absolutely, it absolutely is. And I think I have the right to do that. One of the things, if you want to just change the slide quick, Kirsten, one of the things, so we rotationally graze our animals. We also have enrolled in many NRCS cost share programs, one being the EQIP cost share program. So we got cost share to put in fences, to seed pastures, to put in fences, to install water lines, to have an effective grazing system. So and I think that people should qualify higher for EQIP practices if they have a conservation easement on their farm, because then we know that it's going to stay agriculture and it's not going to get developed, so that those practices could last longer on the farm. That's not the case, but I think you can still enroll in the CRP. We have land enrolled in the CRP. We did get this EQIP cost share for fencing. We are now enrolled in a program that the NRCS has called the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP. So you can still take advantage of any state, federal, and local cost share programs on your farm. So you can change the slide again, please. So I just like this as an example. So like when our children are little, you know, we spend our time with them and we teach them our values and they help each other and they get along really well, right? So these three people will be the next heirs of this property. Our goal is to keep our farm in the property. You can change the slide, please. So they spend a lot of time, you know, enjoying our ponds, the woods, just loving the property. You can change the slide, please. And then all of a sudden this happens really fast, right? And so I no longer have control of what these people do. They're adults moving on in their own lives. And the conservation easement for me makes it a lot easier, because when the property owner, my mother, does pass, I won't have any issues with siblings of what are we going to do with mom and dad's farm? Should we develop it? Should we sell it? What should we do? Like, I want my money out of it, you know? And also now that it's going to be, there's only two of them there, but now it's going to be passed down. You know, these kids are 17, 19, and 22. And when it's their time for property ownership, I feel like the conservation easement is going to make their lives easier, because there's just more people involved. And every generation, as we have more people involved, I feel like decisions will become more complicated, and that this conservation easement will make things easier for them. So this is how we spend our days grazing our cows. But if anybody has any questions, or if I didn't explain anything clearly, but that's how the conservation easement worked for us. And I'm very happy that we have it on our farm.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kristin. Really appreciate that. It was a great example. So Kara, we will pass it back to you so we can finish sharing your slides, and then we will answer the questions from the chat during the Q&A. Thank you, Bob.
I saw one question in the chat that I am also interested in hearing Kirstin's answer to, and that is, Kristin, do you have land in the easement area that is in conservation stewardship program? Are you still able to use, conservation reserve program? Are you still able to use CRP after the easement?
Yes, so we are able to use any state, federal, and local cost share conservation programs. The only thing we cannot do on our farm is sell it for development, develop a sand or gravel pit, and build a CAFO.
Okay, great. That's great to know, because I didn't know the answer to that question. I will flag that's a really good question to ask, and you may get a different answer depending on your state and your local NRCS office. So you would want to make sure that that's not going to create any difficulty remaining in CRP in particular after you have an easement on your property. In one case in Minnesota, there was a little bit of tension that we learned of. So you just want to ask your local NRCS office about that.
And I'm just going to jump in on that. If you get a funky question from your local NRCS office, go over their heads. So different NRCS staff interpret rules differently. And so I cannot imagine why you could not enroll in any conservation programs just because you had a conservation easement on your farm. That really doesn't sound right. So I would go over that person's head or call a conservation coach, or, reach out to Lisa Krivist on this call, and she'll help you find somebody to work with. Renewing the Countryside is great at that. So
thank you. That is really great advice. I appreciate it. All right, so another question in the chat was, how do you find your local easement holding partner? Really great question. And we have a tool for you. This is American Farmland Trust Farmland Protection Directory. And so you can search in your geography or zoom in on the map to find the local land trusts and local government entities in your area that hold easements. And again, that would be your next step if especially if you're in the category of being interested in donating an easement or selling an easement for your land. And the next couple of things that we'll talk about here are, what's that conversation going to look like when you call that easement holding entity in your local area? And just I want to note too that there may be multiple, sometimes geographic areas overlap for easement holding entities. So a good example is in the place where I live, Madison, Wisconsin, or in Dane County. There's both the town of Dunn has a farmland preservation program, and the Groundswell Conservancy is a private land trust that also operates throughout Dane County. So if you happen to be in the town of Dunn, you have the option of calling either the town of Dunn or Groundswell, and they actually work together a lot and really well. Same thing in Jefferson County, as Kristin mentioned. Jefferson County has a program, and that area is also covered by the Drummond Area Land Conservancy. So it's not uncommon that there might be multiple easement holding entities in your area. And then American Farmland Trust is a nationwide organization, so we hold easements all over the country. So we're kind of like an overlay that would apply in lots of places. I want you to be well prepared in that conversation when you're talking with that easement holding entity. So these are some of the questions that you can anticipate that they might ask in that initial conversation. We'll make these slides available to you afterwards, so you don't have to, scribble down notes, but you can see the basics here. They'll want to know about the property. They'll ask, is everyone involved on board with the idea of an easement? How much compensation are you looking to receive in the transaction? What's your timeline? How much longer do you want to own your land? And are there any leases or other easements that are currently in place on the land? Likewise, there are some questions that would be great for you to ask when you're having a conversation with an easement holding entity. How much input will I have regarding the easement language and terms? Will I be asked to make a donation to the Stewardship Fund to make good on that perpetual promise? There are certain transaction costs, such as an appraisal of the property, a site assessment, closing and recording fees. Who will pay for those? Is a good question to ask. At what point in the process, obviously right now you're in the investigation phase, you're not making any hard and fast commitments. But at some point in the process, both parties will be ready to make a commitment that it is hard and fast. So a good question to ask is, tell me about the process. At what point am I locked in or obligated to continue with the transaction? And then a final question is, are you accredited by the Land Trust Alliance, or are you insured through Terra Firma? Terra Firma is basically an umbrella insurance pool for easement holding entities. And so if the entity that you are talking with is insured by Terra Firma, that's a good indication that they're following best practices for an easement holding entity. And a similar mechanism is being accredited through the Land Trust Alliance. It's reasonable for you to ask the question, if what I am seeking out of this transaction is a perpetual promise, is a forever promise about conservation on my land, how do I know that forever is forever? You want to be working with an organization that's going to be around for the long haul. And so these are a couple of mechanisms that can tell you about the strength of their finances and their internal practices. Just a few, to wrap up, things to think about when it comes to the potential of donating a farm. You have the chance to preserve your land and conservation legacy. The option to facilitate the transition to the next generation. Being in the driver's seat of your retirement planning and thinking ahead. Reducing capital gains taxes. Receiving a charitable donation deduction that offsets taxes on earned income. And this last one I think is really special and something that I so appreciate about people who go forward with an easement transaction. You're getting a promise for yourself, but you're also giving something really valuable to the public. And that is the preservation of farmland and open space. American Farmland Trust has done some really groundbreaking, but also kind of eye-popping research on farmland loss. And this is simply the strongest tool for protecting farmland that we have. And that benefits not only you, not only the next people who will farm that land, but all of us. Because we're increasingly looking to land not only to provide food and fiber, but also to provide really valuable ecosystem services. And the ability for land to do that is contingent upon having enough of it that we don't have to squeeze every ounce of production out of every acre. We're going to need more land to do better conservation. And so protecting it for future generations is so important. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm sure Kristin is too. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and yeah.
Thank you so much. Those were amazing points. And thank you to everyone that is writing questions in the chat. We're going to go ahead and I will be going through the chat and listing out a few questions that we didn't get to answer. And then Kara and Kristin, feel free to answer what you can. So the first one, I believe this was for Kara, towards the beginning of your slides, someone asked about forest land in managed forest law contract. How does that work with land easement if you are in a managed forest law contract?
Yeah, good question. Assuming that the forest land is part of a bigger piece of property that also includes farmland, for in that, yes, it's farmland category, then that would be very appropriate for an agricultural conservation easement. And often we would require having a forest management plan as a component of an easement. So you would just continue on with the the forest management practices that you have in place. It's a good question about the compensation. I don't know the particulars of the managed MFL law and whether having an easement would be any impediment to any tax credits that you're receiving under MFL. But it's a good question to ask, but the practices could sure continue, and then we just have to look into the question about compensation or tax credits.
Okay, that's good.
I can say that our farm is in MLF, or it was when the time the conservation easement was put on, and there's no implications that we have to be or we do not have to be, but we have about 75 acres of wooded. Actually, no, we have about 90 maybe that are developed, but yeah, so we were in MLF and it didn't have any effect.
Okay.
Good to know. Thank you. And is there a size or acreage minimum required to get a land easement?
Good question. It would depend. It might depend on whether you're looking at farm donation, easement donation, or easement sale. And especially in the easement sale category, if the funding source is the USDA, they prioritize farms that are around the size of the average size farm in your county. That it's not, I don't think it's a hard and fast, there's no hard and fast, like, must be this size. There's kind of a ranking system. So size may matter in the case of an easement sale. In the
Okay.
case of a farm donation or an easement donation, there's a lot more flexibility.
Okay, perfect. That's good to know.
I think I'd also just add that for an easement sale, I mean, it needs to be developable property. So like you have to be able to, the first step is kind of looking into your county zoning or your town zoning, whoever manages your zoning, and say, okay, on this property, how many houses could I actually build? Because if it's just like a wetland and you can't build any houses, it's going to be a very different situation than if it's a developable property. And every county has or town has different zoning rules, because when you're being paid for the conservation easement like we were, it was like much more complicated than this. But basically, what is the land worth? What would the land sell for agricultural land? And what would it sell for if it was divided into buildable lots? So we could have had like those 9 2-acre lots on our property. So, and that's kind of the difference that we got paid for. So
that makes sense. Thank you. And can you give an example of what development might mean? So is it just developing houses? Is it?
So it's
Anything
developing houses. So it's or industry or, you know, houses. It's pretty much any development, right? So you can't turn it into a subdivision. Industry. We did flag out a farmstead area on our farm. So if we wanted to build another barn or some other buildings, we could do that, but we cannot build cabins to rent out. So really any structures, we would have to have approval from our land trust if they were not within our farmstead footprint. And if they are within our farmstead footprint, which is 17 acres, then they have to be for agricultural purposes, and they have to be of a certain size. Again, we didn't want our farm turned into a capo, so
Right. Okay.
Roofs.
Perfect. 1 second.
It is a really big decision. Like, it's a lot to think about. To say, because, you know, there's times where I was like, oh boy, agritourism is kind of cool. It'd be nice to have some little cabins down by the woods, but I certainly can't do that. So it is a big decision.
Yeah. We haven't.
I'll just mention that it's an interesting question about agritourism, and there's an active conversation among land trusts about how do we strike the right balance between allowing a measure of agritourism that improves farm financial sustainability and making sure that the land remains available for agricultural use. And so if that's something that is an important factor for you, then have that conversation with the easement holding entity about how you could envision agritourism in a way that is consistent with broader agricultural use.
Okay, sorry, and I just realized that we are over time. So I want to say, for anyone that needs to hop off, we completely understand. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have time to stay on for a bit longer, we will be staying on for a few more minutes to continue answering questions. Otherwise, this is also recorded, so you can also check out the recording. But thank you again for joining us. And again, we'll continue with some questions. So I'm going to keep going with that. Somebody asked, where's the question? I lost it. If I think this was specific to Kristin, when you were saying that having your land under an easement is easier for kids and future generations. Can you just elaborate that on it a little bit more on how things will be easier for the kids?
Yeah, so I feel like every time, you know, there's more people involved, people just have different ideas. And so in our scenario, you know, say the property being passed down to me and my 2 siblings, there's no opportunity for development anymore. So maybe one of my siblings would want to develop it and would say like, okay, well then buy me out for these development prices, or, you know, whatever. I just think it just makes it easier. And so then when we pass it to the next generation of kids, I feel like our kids that grow up on the farm and live here probably look at the land differently than people who don't. And then maybe not only do you have those 3 kids, but then they have partners and things happen, right? We all know that. And when times get hard, sometimes land is like a really easy out, you know, maybe to just sell the property or develop it, or say, well, let's just develop half of it and then we'll still have the farm, but we'll have all this money. So I just think that it just makes it easier because that is no longer an option. So.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. And is there a place where you can find a list of land trusts available?
That question may have come in before I shared the.
Oh, that's true. Okay, and we're sharing that with slide. Yes, perfect. Perfect. Thank you for reminding me of that. Okay.
One thing I just kind of want to throw out there is I think it took 3 years for our conservation easement to be done. So it is like if you're interested, start looking into it because it certainly doesn't happen overnight. And that might have been slowed down a little bit by the Walker administration, but I would say for sure it's going to take at least 2 years if you're getting NRCS cost share.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to clarify, you're saying depending on what route you're taking, it might take a little bit longer. It won't necessarily always take 3 years or multiple years. It kind of depends on which route you're choosing, right?
Which route you're choosing, yes. But if you are looking for compensation for that, it's a slow process.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll tag on to that. But thank you, Kristin. So that's the somber news, and the more hopeful news is that we are hopeful that there is more money being made available by the USDA for easements. One source that we're really excited about is the American Farmland Trust, and over a dozen other partners have a regional conservation partnership program grant from the USDA for the next 4 years. And part of that money will go toward easements. There's information about that on the AFT website. So that's one source of funding specific to Wisconsin. Also, just kind of hot off the presses, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was also some additional money put toward easements. It's still not going to be fast, but what that means is that the pipeline may open up a little bit more. And that's a really good reason if you are on kind of a 3, 5, 10-year timeline where an easement would make sense to get your name in the queue at your local land trust for purchase of development rights program. Because this may be the best chance that we've had in a decade to fund easements.
That's so good. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's awesome news. I wanted to ask, I know a lot of people have this question when it comes to programs like EQIP and establishing conservation practices, right? Can you do the thing and then get reimbursed after it's already been done? When it comes to land easements, can people start moving ahead in the process of getting an easement on their land and then kind of go back and try to get the funding to cover it? No, right? You have to go step by step.
Yeah, I mean, I would say no, especially if you're looking for cost share for it from NRCS and you're going that route, just like any other program. No, you have to follow the steps and
Perfect. Thank you.
And I mean, I do know people that have just gone to their county courthouse and wanted to, put something on their deed to just do it themselves. But without working with the land trust, you have nobody to protect that choice. So that's why it's really important to work with an easement holder that can protect your choice. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. And what expectations does the land trust have from the landowner to pay for their monitoring and potential legal defense? How does that get covered?
Good question. In the case of a donation of farmland, the donation itself will cover that cost. So what at American Farmland Trust, for example, if someone donates land to us on the condition that we protect it with an agricultural conservation easement, we take care of all the rigmarole and the paperwork of doing the easement transaction, and then we will resell that property subject to the easement to a new landowner. The land will be worth less because it doesn't have that slip in the bundle, it doesn't have the development rights, but still the sale of that farm, even subject to the easement, it brings in enough revenue that we can fund the stewardship fund for the perpetual monitoring. So that's route number one, the donation of land. On the donation of an easement route, It's probably in the neighborhood of about $10,000 that the easement holder would be looking for from the person donating the easement. Like I said, it might not have to write a check today to do that. You could make a gift in your estate plans. If you protect the farm now with an easement and then sell it in 10 years, you could make a promise to give $10,000 to the easement holding entity then. But it's important to know that that should be something that you anticipate or not be surprised by. And in the case of a sale, often that money would come out of what you would otherwise receive for the sale of the easement. So the stewardship fund would be funded through well, no, I'm going to take that back. I think even in the case of an easement sale, I mean, Kristin, what was it in your case? Sometimes they still need.
Yeah, so I feel like that's really up to each land trust and the finances of that land trust. So Drumlin Area Land Trust is a small land trust, and we needed to donate $10,000 to their stewardship fund. So they don't have any paid staff; they're all just volunteers. But the deal is like, are there going to be legal issues down the road when the property is sold? So I feel like that's super specific to each land trust as to what you'd have to donate.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you both. Okay, so there's an option of donating the farm and the owner can still stay on the land, right? Okay, how does that play out when that owner passes away? Is the surviving family able to remain on the land? Does it end with the initial owner, and then how does that work for the surviving family?
Generally, that life estate or life's use period would just be for one generation. So so if you have two co-owners who are a couple, then each of them could live out their lives on the farm. And there'd be a question, I suppose, if there were minor children. I haven't ever had that case. It's mostly happened when all of the children have flown the nest and you have, co-owners. So it's generally just that generation, not the next generation.
Okay. Yeah. And is there any way at all to set it up where it could pass on to one more generation, or is that not an option?
Legally, yes, you could. The question would be whether you can find an easement holder that would be willing to do that transaction, just because the time horizon is so long.
Right.
It makes it difficult. The longer the time horizon is, the harder it is for an easement holder to plan for that.
Okay, that makes complete sense. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, there was one question that I know I skipped over. It was a longer question from Ingrid. I don't know if Ingrid is still on the call, but if you are and you would like to unmute yourself and ask that, that might be easier. I don't think Ingrid is on the call anymore. Okay, I think I have all the questions from the chat, unless there's any that are still coming in. But if anyone has any questions right now, feel free to continue putting it in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and ask. So wait just a second, see if anything comes up.
Oh, it's really fun to see the helpful comments and people that have chimed in. So yes, let me underline another directory that is the Gathering Waters, Find a Land Trust Near You. And so that one may have have like more detail about some of the land trusts in Wisconsin. So Gathering Waters is great. They're the umbrella organization for land trusts in Wisconsin. So yeah, check out their directory too. Let us know if we're missing any information in our directory. One thing that I'll note is that the AFT directory will have also local government purchase of development rights programs that I think will not be in the Gathering Waters Directory, theirs will be just private or nonprofit land trusts. Ours will be land trusts and also local government entities. On the other hand, Gathering Waters may have like some neat functionality that we don't have. So check out both.
Okay. Thank you, Kara. And I know we had a few people that were from outside of Wisconsin and were focused in Wisconsin, but do either of you know or have any suggestions for those that are outside of the state, what would be the best way for them to find a good, reliable land trust or go about finding someone?
The American Farmland Trust Directory is nationwide, so it'll have all of them.
Beautiful.
I just wanted to throw a thank you out there for all the people that work for Land Trust, because it's really important work, and all the people that work for it and donate all their time. It's like super important work that they do, and they probably don't get a lot of recognition for it. So I just want to shoot a thank you out to all those hardworking folks.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the question from Ingrid, I believe Ingrid isn't on the call anymore, but I will go ahead and read it and see if we can, Kara or Kristin, if you can share anything for anyone else that might have a similar question. So Ingrid had said that all of her land is either in agroforestry, the farmhouse, and the orchard. So she doesn't qualify for a conservation easement. So she thinks she would only qualify for a development easement. How does she keep working her sugar bush while being in the program?
Agroforestry, she's selling agricultural products that would count as agricultural production. So, so that's number one, is that could certainly be considered agricultural property. And so the main question is then, is that a property that an easement holding entity is interested in holding an easement on? And so that may be location specific. So certain land trusts have geographic focus areas or land type focus areas. American Farmland Trust has an agricultural focus, so we really focus on farmland. But I wouldn't say off the bat that her property would not be a candidate for an easement. And, interesting, I'll just mention, because it's top of mind, Driftless Area Land Conservancy is your local land trust if you're in the Driftless area. And talking with their executive director, pretty much 100% of their easements are combination natural land and farmland, because that's what the land is like in the Driftless area. It's some combination of, a 40-acre farm field and some woods or riparian areas or prairie or something like that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.